Music 292, Weeks 10 and 11. Part 1, Simple Form Definitions. Hello, class. This unit's going to differ a little bit because we're essentially going to take 2 weeks to combine. Mainly because I want to present you with some definitions, but then go pretty in depth with how we apply form analysis at sort of the small scale phrase level and then dig our way down to the large scale form level. The information that you're going to find in this definitions video is derived from William Kaplan's classical form, but I have done some tweaks to it, mainly because the vocabulary that Kaplan uses for ternary and rounded binary is a little bit different than what's considered standard in the literature these days. So if you're noticing a discrepancy between my lecture slides and his readings, go with what's on my lecture slides. I can talk a little bit more in depth with that with anyone who's interested. It's not really relevant to this course though. Okay, so let's get started. In this video, I'm going to talk you through the definitions for rounded binary, binary, and ternary forms. You might be familiar with these definitions from the Royal Conservatory curriculum, or possibly some information that you've already covered in Music 191. But in 292, we're going to go a lot more in depth into these form structures. And we're also going to tie these form structures to the phrase models and the phrase deviation structure that we've learned in the last 2 units. This is the point in your theory learning that you have enough knowledge now to dig more in depth into these topics. Let's start with binary form. Binary is a form that contains 2 large sections, which we commonly represent as A and B. Binary does not have any recapitulation of the opening material. In other words, the A does not come back. So at its simplest form, when we're talking about binary, we're essentially just talking about a 2-part form. The sections are going to be defined from each other in some kind of way. So there's going to be some sort of signal of ending at the end of your A section and a new beginning at the beginning of your B section. And commonly, they're going to look like different melodic content. So these are ways that we can help to understand where a section ends and where another one begins. Let's dig more in depth into the properties for each of these A and B sections. The A section in binary has expository function. This is just a fancy way of saying that it presents a theme, and it's a distinct theme that we can recognize. The A section modulates partway through to the dominant, if you're starting in a major key, or the relative major, if you're starting in a minor key. The A sections in binary end with some chord other than the tonic of the home key. And the A sections in binary have conventional phrase organization. What we mean by this is that they're normal phrase lengths commonly, or they don't have a lot of deviations. B's differ from that somewhat. They tend to be more longer and more developmental than A. We'll break down in video 2 what exactly I mean by that. They re-establish the home key. So in the A section, we've modulated away from the home key. In the B section, we come back to our home key. The B sections have looser structured phrase groups. So that's basically a way of saying there are more deviations in B sections. You can expect more things to be so-called abnormal in terms of your overall phrase structure in these sections. B sections commonly incorporate sequences, which we'll see in a couple examples in the next video. And they commonly incorporate motivic material of A with variation. So just a very short aside here before I go on to the next sections. Binaries, more commonly than some of the other forms, will have some similarities between the A and the B sections. Ternary in particular has pretty extreme contrast between your A, B, and then your return of A section. So that's going to be one of the identifying features that we're going to use to try to tell the difference between something that's a binary or rounded binary and something that's a ternary form. The other thing that I want to have a little bit of a aside about here before I go on is that you don't need to have every single one of these features 100% of the time. When we're looking at whether something qualifies as binary form, we're looking that it fits a majority of features. So if you want to just essentially think of this in terms of percentages, we're looking for about, let's say, 70 to 80% fit with the definition list. But you're always going to have something that doesn't quite fit your definitions when you're looking at it from a music theory standpoint. Those are actually the moments of interest. Those are the things that we want to be able to talk about. And we can talk about them by referring to these standard frameworks, to these definitions. So think of these definitions more as like the average of what these pieces do, rather than an exact formula for what every single piece in this repertoire is going to do. These are really more guidelines rather than absolutes. Okay, let's move on. Rounded binary forms have 3 large sections. They have the A and the B like a regular binary does, but then they also bring back the A material at the ending in a somewhat modified way. So our last section repeats the first, but with significant changes. There's going to be enough change that we can tell there's a difference. In rounded binary, your B and your A prime sections are usually grouped together as a unit. So basically what that means is that if you have, for example, double bar lines in your piece, you're going to have them essentially clumping the B and the A prime together. I will point out, though, you're going to start to rely on double bar lines to help you figure out form sections, but not all sections are going to have double bar lines. So you can use that as a hint of like what's happening, but this shouldn't be the only thing that you're relying on to do your analysis. In rounded binary forms, the A section once again has expository function. It presents a theme. It once again modulates partway through to the dominant or the relative major. It ends with some chord other than the tonic or the home key, and it has conventional phrase organization. So these are the same properties that we saw for binary A sections. The B sections, though, in rounded binary are a little bit different than what we saw for binary. In rounded binary, the B sections are usually shorter than the A. The B sections are usually contrasting material compared to the A section, so they're not going to typically have as close a resemblance as they might in binary form. They often prolong 5 or arrive at the dominant key, whereas in regular binary it had to get back to the home key. And the B sections in rounded binary have a retransitional function. They end with a half cadence leading back to the tonic of the home key. So retransitional is basically just saying we have to get back to the point where A can come back, therefore we have to get back to the home key in some kind of way. And the most common ways that Bs do that is by landing on 5 of the home key at the very ending of the B. Lastly, let's talk about the return of the A section. I'm going to use this little apostrophe mark as a prime symbol, and prime is basically saying that there's some kind of variation happening. So A with variation is what's going to happen at the ending of a rounded binary form. This A prime section is going to be a reiteration of motivic material that was first presented in the A section. So we're going to be able to recognize it as the same melody. It's not going to be absolutely identical to A, though. It might be a complete repetition or a partial repetition. So again, there's going to be some modification to it. It's going to start like the original A, but it's probably going to end in some different kind of way. Particularly, the A prime section is altered to provide a suitable final cadence in the home key. And if you actually break this down and think about it, it's pretty logical. Our original A section ended with a chord that wasn't one of the home key. And so because the A prime is ending the whole piece, we need to have a stable tonic at the ending. So there's going to be that change there in terms of the harmony. A primes, I don't have it on my definitions here, but they may have a different length than the original A section, and they may have different harmonies than the original A section. Those are the two most common ways that they get modified. All right, on to our last form that we're going to look at in this unit, and that is ternary form. So ternary is a 3-part form. It has 3 large sections, A, B, and A. Now this is a little bit different from rounded binary because we don't have an A prime at the ending. It's just a restatement of the original A. The last section repeats the first in its entirety. But the big thing about ternary is going to be the stark contrast between its A sections and its B sections. They're going to look very different from one another. Although we'll talk about in the third video how that kind of gets compromised when we're working with composite forms. So because of this extreme contrast, there's going to be some pretty significant differences of what we expect of the internal sections in ternary form. The A section will end with a closed or authentic cadence in the home key. And this is different, right? We talked about in the 2 binary form types that typically that cadence of ending the A section was going to be dominant-ish in some kind of way. But in ternary, that's very different. It's going to end on 1. Ternary A sections are going to start and end in the tonic key, in other words, the home key. They're not going to have a modulation that stays. Although you can have a temporary modulation in the middle. The A sections will have expository function, like binary and rounded binary. They're going to present a theme. And very often they have tight-knit phrase models and phrase structures, so they're often regular length phrases, and they don't tend to feature a huge amount of deviations. Although take that one with a grain of salt, it kind of depends on the scope of your piece. In ternary B sections, what's different here is that they're not developmental in the same kind of way that we saw with something like rounded binary. B sections in ternary are also expository. They present its own new theme. They are commonly in a different key than A, but this is usually via direct modulation rather than a pivot modulation. So typically direct modulation from the end of the A section to the beginning of the B section, and then back again at the ending of B. So in other words, the key change is going to happen right at the beginning of the B section. There's not going to be any kind of overlap. Although the ending of the B is a little bit more flexible. Sometimes it's more transitional. And then lastly, our B section is also going to feature tight-knit phrase models and structure. And this is one of the main differences between ternary and rounded binary. Ternary B sections are going to look like really normal phrases. So it's almost with ternary like you're taking separate tiny pieces and gluing them together. Each one is kind of self-contained. All right, let's talk about the return of our A section. The A section, when it returns, is often exactly the same as the first A. In other words, it literally looks like a copy and paste. There are times when it does have variation though, and I'll get to that in just a sec. When A comes back, it's very often indicated with a da capo symbol. So like you get to the ending of your piece, you have a DCL fine or something thereabouts, and then you go back and you repeat. So this is the one exception to something I mentioned earlier in this course, which was that earlier I said generally repeat signs and that sort of thing don't really impact the theoretical analysis. In ternary, it does, because the repeat that you go back, you're not just repeating the entire whole thing over again, you're only repeating the A section over again when you do that. So it has an impact on our larger scale perception of form. So I also mentioned that ternary can modify that A section. If it does do that, it's going to modify it in superficial kind of ways. The length and the harmony should be the same as the first A section so that we can recognize it as having the same underlying structure. That return of the A section may feature melodic elaboration during the second A section, but really only at a superficial level. And what I mean by that is it might have, for example, added non-chord tones, but it's not going to have significant changes. Maybe it changes the octave of something, but it's not going to change the key, for example. Maybe it changes the orchestration, but it's not going to fundamentally change the harmony. So that's your general overview of the three forms. I'm going to return to these definitions in the next video, and I'll present more specific examples to help you break it down a little bit. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.